Hello, and welcome to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Siri Vincent Plough, and I'm so glad you're here. This is the show where I explore heathenry through a queer lens. We will be talking about traditional witchcraft, runes, folklore, and so much more. Join us, won't you, as we journey to the ends of the 9 realms and back. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Heathen's Journey podcast. I am so excited to have this guest on this week. I have been sitting on this interview for quite a while. So as the leaves are turning and we are moving into fall, we're past the autumn equinox now, I always start to think about going back to school. I am that nerd who always loved going back to school season. And I just love the kind of possibilities that are in the air for learning and growing and expanding your horizons. And this interview is the perfect interview to get you thinking as a student of occultism. This week, I'm having Eric Purdue on the podcast. Eric recently finished the first translation of the 3 books of occult philosophy in over 300 years. That's right. Eric has spent the better part of a decade translating the behemoth that is the 3 books of occult philosophy. So there are several reasons for this. If you are a student of occultism or Western esotericism, then you know that this is a really important tome in magical history and for magicians to this day. And the unfortunate fact is that all of us have been utilizing translations that were inaccurate. And Eric and I go in depth into the issues that he ran into as a translator. I personally find this really fascinating, especially as I am attempting to pick up some Scandinavian languages and working to translate some sources on my own. It's really intense, and this is deep, incredible work. And so I was so excited when I heard about this happening that I reached out to Eric immediately. So I found out about this project from Matthew Venus, who was on the podcast back in March. And I did not realize at the time that I reached out to Eric Purdue in March that the book was not coming out until November. So I have been sitting on this podcast episode waiting until it was a more appropriate time to release this interview. And now is the perfect time. So the book is available for pre-order. It comes out on November 16th, I believe. And now is the great time to reserve your copy. So I actually, in the apothecary, now have the book on pre-sale, so you can pre-order the book from me. And pre-sales are really important. They help kind of publishers and booksellers understand the demand for books. And they also really help the authors by kind of being included in the author's first week of sales, which is really critical for a book release. So if you are interested in supporting this work, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you pre-order the 3 books on my website. Now, I will warn you, they are fancy books. So they're a little on the expensive side, but that is because it is a leather-bound box set. And if you are a serious student of occultism, you absolutely want this translation. All right. But in terms of this translation, I will let Eric speak for himself. Welcome to the podcast, Eric. It is so fantastic to have you. So by way of introduction, what is your current work? We're here to talk about the 3 books of occult philosophy, but I know that you're also a magician and an astrologer working in different capacities. So What is that mix for you?
Thanks for having me. My current work is very much still 3 books of occult philosophy. We're still we're in final editing stages, so it's in the forefront of my mind and my life right now. So I started out accidentally getting involved with Afro-Cuban Santeria / leukemia, and that was really my first serious introduction. I was interested like anybody else in buying books, and I bought Starhawk like everybody else did in the 80s. And I bought books by, I bought some Crowley and, read some histories of the Golden Dawn. I figured that's what I had to do. And then I accidentally was introduced to a Santero. I didn't know he was a Santero, and he didn't tell me he was. And to make a very long story short, I learned very quickly that I just basically wanted what he had, whatever that was. And so I've been involved with that since 1990. It's been a little while. And I was initiated as a Santero or priest of Santeria leukemia. We call it leukemia. In 2000. And I've been very active in that world ever since. And in 2005, my teachers, we call them godparents in leukemia, he passed away, and I realized I needed to kind of get back to my basics a little bit. So that's when I actually revisited Agrippa for the first time, because he talked to me about him a lot, and he introduced me to Agrippa and Picatrix. And back in the 90s, when no one was really talking about them, seems like. And that made me, get back into astrology. And from reading Picatrix and Agrippa, I realized that the astrology that I had heard about was not the astrology I was reading about. And that put me down another rabbit hole. So that's my other world, is doing pre-modern, primarily medieval European and Arabic astrology and astrological magic. My magical world nowadays is primarily more of the, leukemia Afro-Cuban variety. But I do astrological consultations, and I hope to increase that when this all dies down. And then, I do some astrological magic as well. So.
Fantastic. Yeah. So that is a pretty good lead in to my first question for you, which is, why a new translation of Agrippa? Why now? And what drew you to this project?
Well, why now is because I'm doing it. So when I first started reading 3 books several years ago, once I started studying traditional astrology, I started noticing some issues. And I had a lot of conversations with Christopher Warnock, who is, kind of the, I guess the grandfather of modern traditional astrological magic to most of us. He was really one of the early proponents in our time. And I had a lot of conversations with him, and he also brought up some issues. And, primarily that the astrological sections in Agrippa don't really make sense in the existing English translation. And Donald Tyson, who edited it, really didn't catch it either. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But so that was my first impetus, was to see really how far this went. And because I'm a very orderly person, I started with chapter 1. So I just as a test, I translated, I think, the first 5 chapters just to see how it went. And I very quickly noticed that, as early as, I think it was chapter 3, I started noticing some problems. Some, translation errors that were not astrological, that were actually mistranslations. And I also quickly realized that Tyson was not sourcing Agrippa's actual primary sources as well. So I thought it was important to approach this book on its own terms and exactly what the Latin says. And then at the same time, use sources that Agrippa would have had access to, as opposed to, modern or 19th century sources, second or tertiary sources that Agrippa could not have had. I guess you want me to get more into what the problems, right?
Right, yeah. So I think we're going to frame this podcast episode around just like how to even begin studying Agrippa, because it is a poorly translated, until this new edition, a poorly translated 16th century text. But it still has huge ramifications in occult history, of course, and therefore in occultism today. So what has been the importance of the three books in, your practice, and how do you see that sort of ripple effect?
Well, I think it's, to begin with, I think the importance in the history of the occult is huge, because it as soon as it was published, it became a source book. And the reason why is because there really aren't that many books on magic that compile so many different sources together into one volume. So just from a convenience standpoint, it's important, because you don't have to necessarily buy 200. Three books sources about 200 books, so you don't necessarily need to have all 200 of these books, to get all the juicy parts out. And Agrippa really did take the best material out of some of these books, I think. So that's important, and it became a source book pretty much immediately. Anytime anybody talked about planetary sigils, the esoteric use of stones, plants, animals, that kind of thing. Agrippa's incense recipes, and just that kind of like worldview. It became one of the sources of the Golden Dawn when they were formulating their system, and that, of course, had a huge ripple effect in just 20th century magic in general, because the Golden Dawn is so primary to 20th century magic. All roads seem to lead to Agrippa at some point, seems like. For me personally, that's what really made me understand that there was an important philosophical and practical break between modern and traditional magic and astrology. And it really kind of drove that home to me, because I think a lot of us instinctively know this, but it isn't necessarily, I don't think, really, it isn't really driven home to us very much. And it isn't as laid out as coherently as Agrippa does it. So doing that deep read of Agrippa taught me how to see the universe in a different way, which is a problem today, because we're all raised in a modern scientific materialist worldview. And most of the magic that we do, assuming it's at least based in a pre-modern mindset, comes from that same world. It comes from a world that believed in spirits as actual beings and not parts of the mind. It's a world where astrology was expected to actually tell the future of events, and also to diagnose medical problems. You're expected to be able to provide, as an astrologer, very concrete answers. And this is the world this all comes from. And today we've that's all become kind of diluted. And I think a lot of magicians are accustomed to accepting very small results as very big results.
Right.
And so Agrippa, I think this close read really helped, I think, formulate that in my mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Agrippa can help us get to a lot of, once you study Agrippa, you can kind of see that impact in a lot of other areas. And then okay, bear with me. I know that I didn't send this to you as a question before.
Okay.
I'm going off script.
That's all right.
So I am just very curious about the mistranslations that you talked about in the material that you sent me before this interview, and then how that impacts the secret societies like the Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn impacts Crowley. Crowley impacts Wicca. And so you kind of like get further and further from this source material, but it's all cited. Like, like people are constantly citing Agrippa as occult reference. So that's a very messy question. But maybe can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you a messy answer.
Great.
So I think there's two streams of thought with this. I'm not sure necessarily how much. Well, some of the mistranslations have caused a couple of issues, or potential issues, but I think for the most part, a lot of the mistranslations have been ignored, because some of the material, some of the names of things are incorrect. And I can go into this in more detail in a second. But some of these names are incorrect. Some of the sigils are oriented incorrectly. But I think that the Golden Dawn being, I think that the Golden Dawn being like an entity as it is, and being as influential as it is with Crowley and so on and so forth, I think that's a different question to me, because that, I guess I'll go on that rant first. That really speaks more of a break with the way people thought was possible with magic and astrology to begin with. And I'm not sure how far you want me to go into this, but basically, the history of astrology and magic sort of have parallel histories in many ways. And they were in the old days they were intertwined. And with the development of the Enlightenment in Europe, the importance of magic and astrology were, of course, degraded a lot. And in the 18th century, the 1700s, the practice of magic and astrology, at least, textually speaking, wasn't quite as prevalent. It existed a little bit, and there were a few things here and there, but it wasn't as prevalent as it was before. And by the mid 1800s, you started having some developments such as the development of New Thought, which is essentially the precursor to The Secret, the development of Theosophy and things like that. And so that spurred a new growth in magic and astrology. So the Golden Dawn really comes from this world of like New Thought and Theosophy, in this kind of and having a more transcendental view of magic, as opposed to the older view of magic, which is more of like medicine. And that's a whole subject I could rant on about forever. But with the mistranslations, there are things like in one chapter, JF translates ruby as a jet stone. And the jet stone seems to be something JF really liked. JF, by the way, is the person who translated the 17th century translation of 3 books that basically everyone has now. Tyson's edition is the JF version, but edited. In chapter 33, in book 1, the letters of the planets are flipped around. In fact, many editions flip these around differently, and I actually had to make a decision on that. The sigils for the planets for Mercury and the Moon are flipped around, are oriented differently than they should be. Now, these are tied to magic squares. So if you're trying to recreate the sigils from the magic squares, it will not work with JF's version because the sigils are flipped around. That should drive every chaos magician nuts.
Yeah.
There's a lot of astrological terminology that's incorrectly translated. And I think that to a certain extent, Tyson can be forgiven on some of this because the modern study of traditional astrology really hadn't gotten too far when his edition came out. So Tyson just did not have a lot of material available to him. So example, JF translates the, so there's something called the decans, which I think are kind of popular now. The decans are 10-degree divisions of the zodiac. So there's 36 decans. And in astrological magic, each decan has a spirit associated with them. And it's also one of the measures of planetary strength in traditional astrology. But JF translated decan as faces and heads.
Oh.
Which makes no sense.
Right.
And I said it would be partial. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there was another one that was instead of profaction, it's perfection.
Yeah, so the way JF translated it is, this is from chapter 59 of book 1. He says, the most effective dreams are when the moon runs through the 9th sign of the nativity or the revolution of that year. Or the 9th sign of the sign of profection. That's what it's supposed to be. And JF translated profection as perfection. So traditional astrology, profections are a predictive tool. A profection is where each sign represents a year. The first, so on the ascendant, the rising sign, that's going to be your birth year. So you're born, whatever your rising sign is. Let's say it's Aries. So Aries is going to be for the year you were born. On your first birthday, you move down to the second sign, which is Taurus, which would be the second house in your chart. And you keep circling around each iterations of 12. So you have 12-year cycles. So he translated this as perfection. So Tyson made a note saying that he basically tried to understand what perfection meant. So he thought that perfection meant a full moon. So you had to wait for a full moon. And also from the same sentence, because the sentence says, when the moon runs through the 9th sign of the nativity. Now, any traditional astrologer would understand that as either the 9th house or the 9th sign from the ascendant, because the 9th house represents religion, spirituality, things like that. Also academics, but that's beside the point, and travel. But dreams would be ruled by the 9th house. So that's why he would have said that. Tyson didn't understand that, and he said that it meant the 9th sign from your sun sign.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which is problematic. Difference. It's a huge difference, and also traditional astrologers didn't do sun signs to begin with.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. But the thing with decans is interesting because he said faces and heads. And one of the alternate names for decan is a face. And you'll see that a lot in traditional literature. So JF obviously looked at this and saw faces, which is correct. And then, decan, and the Latin for decan is decani or decani. And I don't know where he got heads from. So I think he just kind of guessed. Another astrological one was there's an astrological concept called a term or bound, which is they call it an essential dignity. It's another way, just like decans, of determining strength. And there's 5 terms per sign. There's the 5 non-luminaries rule a term. And JF translated that as mark. And and Tyson made a footnote saying that it means the degree of a sign. Or I mean the degree of the zodiac, sorry. So there'd be according to him, there would be 360 marks, I guess. But yeah, it's a totally different idea.
Wow, yeah. So clearly this is a very necessary translation.
I think so.
Yeah. Just to kind of correct a lot of this stuff, what are the ramifications for, ceremonial magicians I'm thinking ceremonial magicians in particular, because most of the people that I know that really run with Agrippa tend to be ceremonial magicians.
Mhm.
But what are the ramifications for modern occultists who have been working with either the Tyson translation or previous translations of Agrippa?
Well, I think, first of all, some of the materials are wrong.
Yeah.
So I've already run into that with astrological magic, because, for instance, it says, I wish I could remember where it is now, but I think it's in the chapter of, it's a chapter on fixed stars, where he talks about the stones that are attributed to each of the fixed stars. And I think it's the one for Regulus, if I'm not mistaken, is usually, in fact, almost everyone translates it as granite. So we have a lot of astrological magicians making rings for Regulus with granite. But the actual stone is garnet. That's a big difference. I mean, granite maybe, but it's kind of funny. The Latin is as close as the English is to the two words. It's one letter different. So there's that. I mean, I think the materials are a big one. And I think that knowing that the sigils are oriented incorrectly is important. I don't think it really invalidates the magic with the sigils, but if you're trying to recreate it, it definitely is important, for sure. But I think that for some ceremonial magician, the materials are going to be the most obvious thing. Making sure you have the right stones, plants, and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, some of these just can't be translated, though, which makes me think that Agrippa didn't really know some of them himself. I think he was just, copying in some cases. But also, the Agrippa lays out the magical worldview from bottom to top and top to bottom, as above, so below, very systematically. And I think that that's probably the most important feature of this, because most books on magic that are written at any time, but especially today, tend to be very technique heavy. So people are essentially copying these recipes over and over and over again without really knowing why they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's absolutely vital to this. I mean, yeah, they know why, to the sense that they're doing it for a spirit or for a particular result. I mean, that's obvious. But, where is this in, I guess, in relation to the universe? And why should this even work for you to begin with?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of it, that, when I'm teaching my own students in witchcraft and magic, I like to say, all right, start with the why and then build. Mm-hmm. Start with why you even want to do the spell and then go from there, which feels just very rational to me, which is probably, I don't know, indicative of something. But
it should be rational, though.
It should, yeah. Like it should. You should also be doing magic for a purpose, I feel, right?
Yes.
Not just to do it, because I've definitely seen people just do magic constantly, and you can lose yourself.
Well, that to me, that kind of again goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that we kind of have this preoccupation with seeing magic as this transcendental act. And so, if you look at our beloved, social media posts and forums, which we all love, there's a lot of talk about, okay, well, I did this ritual and it worked for me. Or they'll say things like, oh, I got a feeling. Okay, the flame was flickering in a certain way, so I know that spirit was there. And that might be, and those things might have worked for you. But the thing I can't shake is that this is something that I think is kind of I think it's become highlighted to me because of my Afro-Cuban experience, is that there's a diminished there's a diminished expectations. Diminished expectations right now. So the magicians are expecting less from the magic. So when those little things happen, then the belief is that, okay, something huge happened. And,
right.
Whereas what I've seen with again, I'm speaking this in an Afro-Cuban sense, that I've seen extremely big things happen, even though nothing appeared to be happening during the actual ceremony. And I'm saying things like, you do this ceremony because you need to have X, Y, and Z happen, and those exact 3 things have to happen. And if those things don't happen, then the magic just didn't work, regardless of flickering flames and shivers that you got or whatever. It either worked or it didn't work. And at the end of the day, that's how we have to be approaching this magic. You know, we're not really here to, you know, have our heads in the clouds and just to mindlessly, you know, devote ourselves to these spirits. At the end of the day, the spirits should be working for us. And we should be expecting something from that.
I was talking to Johannes the other day about just this very topic of, like, you know, knowing results and tracking results and doing magic for specific purposes. And it was really resonant, basically. You know, he was like, yes, I am a professional magician and I do magic and get results for people. That is important, and it's how you operate.
It is. It sounds really basic, but I see this, so many people stumbling on this, because in our modern age, it is definitely a little bit of a stumbling block to see spirits as actual beings. And there's, you know, I think that for many of us, and I'm not excluding myself, that we tend to see, you know, spirits and magic as purely a psychological process. And even if you believe that spirits are objective beings, I think us living in the world that we do, there's always a part of your brain that kind of questions it a little bit. And anybody who says they don't do that anymore, I think we're lying, because I think it's just part of the background of life that we have right now. But I mean, no one's absolute with that thinking. But you know, it's taking me years and years and years of, you know, having the magic speak to me in very objective ways to actually get through my tough skin. And it's, you know, that's, you know, when you're talking about Agrippa, they didn't necessarily have that issue. I mean, you always had skeptics.
Naturally, of course.
I mean, Cicero was one of them. But the thing is that the overarching worldview at the time was, you know, the church may not have liked astrology, but they believed it was real. They may not have liked demons, but they believed it was real. They weren't saying, okay, you know, all of you need to go to therapy to get the demons out of your head, you know, because you're imagining things. They believe these are objectively real. And that's not necessarily just a byproduct of living in the ancient world. You know, if there are magical societies, you know, Afro-Cubans are an example of these. Are, you know, it's part of it's in the water, you know. And I think, you know, probably your experience with trolldom, it's just a little bit of that's kind of in the water there, you know. It's in the blood. But in America, we've lost our traditions by and large. At least white people have.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, we have to sort of reclaim or relearn, not reclaim, because it starts to sound creepy after a bit. But right. I don't mean it that
relearning.
way. Relearn it. I don't want to sound creepy. Yeah, we have to retrain our brains to we have to relearn our traditions. Yes, exactly. And that takes many forms. I mean, I'm hearing doing Afro-Cuban. I'm a priest in Afro-Cuban religion, and I'm as white as they could be. But and it wasn't my plan to do it. But I mean, it's there, and there are a lot of places, there are a lot of cultures in the world today that have that magical thinking, sort of, you know, like I'm saying, in the water. It's just there, even if they're not necessarily working in a particular tradition per se. It's just there. I was talking to my godmother about that recently. Yeah. She's Cuban, and she said that, Cuba, that even, not everybody is a practitioner of leukemy. Pretty much everybody calls themselves Catholic, but they're not all into leukemy. There's a lot of traditions in Cuba that some of them aren't as popular in America, but there are a lot of traditions there, and it could be you could be leukemy, you could be just working in spiritism, you could be part of the Abaquá, or you could be Palo Manombe, all these other things, or you could just be a Catholic. And even if you're just a Catholic and you don't identify with any sort of African or esoteric tradition, when the shit hits the fan, that's where they go. And also, she was telling me that, if your baby has colic and they're crying all the time, there's just something, there's things they do for that. That that's not really considered to be just magical, but it is. It's just, they just do it. And we don't really have that in America as much today.
Yeah, I'm hoping later this summer to have a conversation with Corey of New World Witchery. And he just published a treasure trove of North American folk magic, which I'm really excited to dig into. I have not yet. But that's part of it, is kind of seeing the roots that are still there, still operating, and then tracing them back. And I've definitely found with Trolldome, within that tradition, one of the very first things that we did was learn how to see spirits and, learn how to recognize when a spirit is present and when they aren't.
You don't learn that from a book.
No, you don't. It's experiential. You have to learn it, with someone else. There are definitely experiments that you can do, and ways that maybe a solitary person who is very attuned could attempt, to learn it. But it's a lot more efficient, I should say,
I agree.
To get help from a teacher in that kind of aspect. But then also, it's laying foot on, the soil of your ancestors as well. And feeling that, being oh, this is where the magic that, is within my own lineage has come from. I had that experience when I spent a summer in Norway, and I definitely had that experience there. We have strayed very far from your work.
That's what I do.
Yes, but it's absolutely, I think it's an important point, though, because I want this podcast episode to be about how do we approach this very old text and, use it and work with it to kind of contextualize it for our modern selves, right? We have a very different mindset than Agrippa did, or anyone reading Agrippa did. We have a very different mindset than JF did, right? So
I don't even know what JF's mindset was.
Right, yeah, nobody knows. JF is anonymous. So it's important to kind of trace it back in this way. So one of the things that's really struck me from reading the introductory materials that you sent me was talking about how the 3 books are very difficult to use as reference materials because they are constantly referencing information from within themselves, and constantly circling back upon information. And that's almost always how the three books are presented. This is a reference book. Please don't read it cover to cover.
Right.
So how does a student even approach it in that instance?
Well, it is difficult. I'm not going to lie. And, my hope is that my translation will be easier to read. That is not to say that it's easy. I don't think it's an easy book. Regardless, I don't think it was an easy book in Latin to Latin readers, but I think that in absence of a commentary of some kind, the best way is at the beginning, because the book is methodically laid out. It's very well organized. And so in the last chapter, when Agrippa says, that he mixed up the material, it isn't, a lot of people want to, Da Vinci code it and think that there's some like crazy hidden message if you decode it, but really it's just efficiency. And the example that I've given before is, it's like reading a French cookbook. There's going to be a chapter somewhere that talks about the various, mother sauces in French cooking. And then maybe halfway through the book, there'll be a recipe that says, okay, you have to make, this chicken requires a bechamel, and they're not going to have the recipe for the bechamel. And now, of course, they're going to probably reference it, but Agrippa did not do that. So Agrippa is constantly referring to material that he talks about earlier in the book. So the only way to really know this is to read it. My hope is that my version is easier to understand, but the book starts out with the most basic ideas possible. He starts out with the magic, which most books today don't even. How many books on magic are written today don't have a definition of magic? So there's that, and then he goes into elements, and then he kind of starts expanding from there. And heck, there aren't many books that talk about elements today that actually define what the elements are. And Agrippa does that. So I think for now, until someone, perhaps myself, writes a commentary on it, the best approach is to read it very carefully and from the beginning. And it'll take a long time.
It is a bit of a behemoth, yes.
I'm not going to lie. It's the first time I read it, I did read it cover to cover, and I think it took me a few months. And I don't think I understood everything. At this point, I think I've read it close to a dozen times. So, but yeah, I really wish there was some other material out there that discussed the magic of the astrology of that time in a concise manner, not just a translation. I can't think of anything like that for now, and I really wish there was something I could say for that.
I had asked what supplementary materials you could use as a student to approach this text with, and I think that before we hit record, you had said there's not much other than the other sources that Agrippa was citing, but it'll be harder to read actually.
Well, there's, and I just thought of one book that is easy to get and very cheap, under $10 probably, but it's called The Elizabethan Worldview, by Tilliard. Do you know that one?
I've heard of it. Yeah. Yeah.
It was written by a professor of Shakespearean studies, and he originally wrote it for his students to help them get into Shakespeare's mindset, which essentially isn't really much different than Agrippa or anybody else. That's a pretty good book, and it's short as well. But that really gets you into headspace more than anything else. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really. I don't think it really lays out. It's not going to lay out Agrippa's ideas of what of magic are, or traditional astrology or anything like that. And one of the things that I think is interesting with Agrippa's book is that, the entire book is made up of quotes. Almost the entire book. And, entire chapters are just made up of quotes from other books strung together. But the interesting thing is that Agrippa was using these quotes for a couple of reasons. First of all, to show his scholarship. That's the way people did it back then. But the other reason is that he was formulating his own argument on magic. And he was doing this by quoting other people. But he, William Burroughs style was, kind of like cutting and pasting these together to a new idea, and to his own personal idea, which is a fascinating concept to me. So, part of this was that he was answering some problems that, as much as he followed Ficino and Trithemius and people like that, there are certain holes in their arguments, like in what the role of spirits are and that kind of a thing. So Agrippa was trying to answer those problems, or trying to solve those problems by quoting Ficino and Trithemius and church fathers and other people. And I don't think anybody has really done that, which is why I can't think of any other primary sources, because even if you go, or any introductory sources, because, in a sense, Agrippa is an introductory source. Just hard to read.
Yeah. Difficult for the modern eye text to read. It seems to me like it would be helpful for there to be like a series of books on magical history, but that actually talk about like the techniques of magic that come out of those different periods in time.
That would be interesting.
Kind of like a historical reference. Like, I know that this is, like the author recognizing that this is not how we do magic now, but that there are some techniques that you can still use.
It's almost like what Thorndike did with the history of magic, except from the standpoint of a practitioner.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
What has surprised you the most about this work?
Well, I think a couple things that spring to mind is, one, I didn't realize how much of the book was made up of quotes. I think it's a surprise to most people. And I had those all footnoted, but it's a lot of ideas that we attribute to Agrippa really aren't his. I guess the way he put this together is his idea, but he's using other people's words, which is, I don't know, to me again, it's a fascinating idea. I can't imagine writing a book that way today. Can you imagine trying that with your library?
Oh my God. Whew. Things would get strange quickly.
Things would get strange, and you get sued quickly too.
Yes, absolutely. The
other surprise to me was how few books on magic Agrippa really quoted. He basically didn't quote any grimoires in the book. Unless you count Picatrix as a grimoire. But even that is quoted in kind of a strange way, because it's not really just a straight quote. He was, again, copying and pasting different things together, and Picatrix is part of it. But he was essentially, I think he wanted to keep things kind of conservative, because he's already in dangerous territory with the subject matter. So to a large extent, he's quoting established writers on church fathers. He quotes the Bible. He quotes a lot of commentary on the European style of Kabbalah and things like that. So he kept things very conservative in a lot of ways. So it wasn't like he was sourcing. I expected to learn of some new grimoires or or just magical material in general, from translating it. And then I realized that, it really wasn't that spooky, which might turn some people off. I mean, I think some people might be expecting to, find another, Keys of Solomon or something out of it. You're not going to find that. But you will learn how to approach the Keys of Solomon from reading this. But yeah, that was a surprise to me.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm formulating a question. This is a messy question again.
Okay.
Perhaps does not have an answer. I know that a lot of folk magicians, had access to resources like the, three books, and two grimoires as well. So what would you say is the influence of the three books on kind of folk magicians operating in Europe, both contemporary to Agrippa and then moving forward?
My suspicion is that a lot of folk magicians also used it as a reference book.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they were necessarily trying to discover a new way to think. I think that they were mining it for material. So,
right.
His chapters on the planetary correspondences of herbs and stones and whatnot is huge. I mean, that's a huge influence. Not as unique as it seems like it would be, but it's a huge influence. So I think that was a primary use. And of course, just that, I don't think that Tyson was trying to fool anybody, but it was used to make the book palatable, I think by the publisher, but the graphics that are in the original are mostly things like sigils, and that just by itself is a huge influence, because I can't think of any books that are earlier, besides some of the grimoire stuff, but there aren't that many books that really go deep into the sigils and formulating them out of magic squares.
Mm-hmm.
That I can think of in Agrippa. I mean, they existed because Agrippa also sourced things, but just in the popular sense. And that in and of itself has been a huge influence. And also, I mean, in folk magic, I know in Latin America, a lot of these books were, Agrippa's one of them, but were mined and translated into Spanish and put into different volumes and sold, and that's been sort of like a little bit of an underground thing, though.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to share with listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I think my hope is that, right now we have, over the last few years, we've had some really good translations in both magic and astrology. Stephen Skinner has a ton of them now.
Yes.
And Skinner has done a really good job of contextualizing these and writing his own commentary. But Agrippa's been a major one that really hasn't been tackled in quite the same way. And so Agrippa's got a lot of lip service by a lot of magicians as being influential, and certainly the book exists on a lot of bookshelves. So my hope is that this can be looked at with fresh eyes,
mm-hmm.
and people could kind of understand its place in the in the history of the rest of grimoire. I mean, really, three books is not a grimoire, but to just sort of see its place in that history as well. Because I think it's unclear to a lot of people where he stands.
Yeah, and also just I think that there's, from my perspective as a teacher of witchcraft and magic, I think that there is a lot to be learned from studying Agrippa, and also I think that I'm hopeful that your translation will make it a little bit easier, a little bit more palatable for modern kind of audiences to learn from.
That was my goal.
Yeah. I'm very excited to read it. When is it coming out?
It is coming out November, I believe, 16th, if I remember correctly. It's on the internet. It's coming out November, and by Inner Traditions.
Fantastic.
And you can pre-order from their website and also Amazon. And one thing I do want to point out, there's been some confusion with the different editions I have out there. So the publication history has been a little bit complicated.
Oh, okay.
So the Inner Traditions one is the official one. There's, I did a book one a few years ago, which only exists on which you could get from eBay, and it's overpriced. And then there was another one that was going to come out that didn't, but there were pre-orders available for that. So you have to be kind of careful, but it's the Inner Traditions version.
Right. And yours will have all three.
It'll be all three. It's a box set.
Ooh. Wonderful. So exciting. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast today. I am so excited to read this new tome, this box set of three. It is a tome. New tomes.
With a capital T.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Wasn't that fantastic? If you have your curiosity piqued and are interested in getting your hands on a copy of the 3 books of occult philosophy as translated by today's guest, Eric Purdue, you can head on over to my website and pre-order. I will also include a link in the show notes. And that is it for today's episode of the Heathen's Journey podcast. A huge thank you and shout out to all of my students and patrons for making this work available. If you want to become a patron and support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/northernlightswitch. I post full moon and new moon ritual guides, rune readings for each of the turning of the zodiac season, and so much more. If you would like to follow me in between episodes, you can find me on Instagram at northern.lights.witch or on Twitter at northlightwitch. Until next time, stay weird.